No one in Daniel Harris's quiet Illinois neighborhood imagined that an ordinary Tuesday would split his life into before and after, but it did, and it happened so fast that he would later struggle to remember the small details, only the sharp feeling of fear that followed him everywhere. That evening, Emily was in the kitchen preparing dinner while Sophie colored at the table, and Daniel answered a few last emails from work, the house warm with the smell of tomato soup and fresh bread, when suddenly there was a loud crash and Daniel looked up to see Emily on the floor, her hand still near the counter, her face pale in a way he had never seen before, and in seconds he was beside her, calling her name, his voice shaking as Sophie began to cry, and the next few minutes felt like a blur of panic, sirens, and flashing lights as paramedics rushed in, speaking calm but urgent words, lifting Emily onto a stretcher while Daniel stood frozen, holding Sophie tightly and praying under his breath. At the hospital, everything turned white and cold. The bright lights, the long hallways, the quiet seriousness on the doctors' faces. And when they told him it was a sudden heart complication and that she needed immediate care, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, as if the steady life he trusted had been built on something fragile all along. Emily was taken into intensive care, machines began to breathe and beep around her, and Daniel sat beside her bed holding her hand, whispering promises about vacations they still had to take and movies they still had to watch, hoping somehow she could hear him. He called Margaret Collins that night, his mother-in-law, his voice breaking as he explained what happened, and there was silence on the other end before Margaret responded in her usual steady tone that she would catch the first flight from Seattle in the morning. Margaret had always been strong, organized, and direct, the kind of woman who never let emotion stop her from acting. And when she arrived the next day with a firm hug and sharp eyes that took in everything at once, Daniel felt both comforted and uneasy because her presence filled the room in a way that demanded order. She stepped into the hospital like someone who had already decided what needed to be done, speaking confidently with nurses, asking detailed questions, writing down medical terms in a small notebook, and telling Daniel to go home for a few hours to shower and rest. But he refused at first, not wanting to leave Emily even for a moment. Still, Margaret gently insisted, reminding him that exhaustion would not help anyone. And so Daniel drove home alone to a house that felt too quiet without Emily's laughter, too still without her music playing softly in the background. When he walked in, he noticed how messy everything looked. Dishes in the sink, toys scattered on the floor, coats thrown over chairs, small signs of a life interrupted, and before he could even think about cleaning, Margaret arrived later that afternoon with 2 suitcases and a determined expression, and without asking for permission, she began restoring order, washing dishes, folding laundry, organizing Sophie's school backpack, and speaking in calm, practical sentences about schedules and responsibilities. Daniel was grateful because he did not know how to manage it all alone. Yet as he watched her move through the rooms, opening cabinets and adjusting shelves, he felt something shift, as if control of his home was slowly slipping from his hands. Margaret rearranged the kitchen so items were easier to reach, replaced a broken lamp in the living room, and even suggested moving the couch to create more space, explaining that a fresh layout could help everyone feel less trapped. And though Daniel nodded, he noticed how the house no longer looked exactly like the one he and Emily had shaped together. At the hospital, Margaret stood beside him every day, offering practical advice while Daniel struggled with quiet fear. And when doctors used complex terms or gave uncertain answers, Margaret responded firmly, asking about next steps and possible outcomes, becoming the steady voice he lacked. Sophie quickly grew attached to her grandmother's presence, finding comfort in Margaret's predictable routines, warm breakfasts, and bedtime stories, told in a calm voice that never trembled. And Daniel began to depend on that stability more than he expected. At night, after long hours at the hospital, he would sit at the kitchen table, staring at unpaid bills and insurance papers, his mind heavy with worry, and Margaret would place a cup of tea in front of him without a word, her gestures simple but meaningful. And in those quiet moments when the house was dark and Sophie asleep, Daniel felt less alone, as if someone else understood the weight pressing on his chest. Still, beneath that comfort, there was tension he could not name, because Margaret's efficiency sometimes felt like authority, her decisions made quickly, her suggestions firm, and Daniel started to wonder whether he was slowly becoming a guest in his own life. One evening, he returned from the hospital earlier than usual and found Margaret in the living room holding one of Emily's photo frames, studying it thoughtfully before placing it on a different shelf where the light would not fade it. And though her intention was harmless, Daniel felt a strange sting watching that small change, realizing how many quiet adjustments were happening around him. He told himself it did not matter, that survival was more important than pride. Yet each day the balance in the house shifted a little more. Margaret speaking confidently with doctors, teachers, and neighbors, while Daniel drifted between fear and gratitude. As winter settled over the city and hospital visits became routine, Daniel's exhaustion deepened, and he began leaning on Margaret's strength without fully noticing how much space she occupied in every part of his world, from the kitchen table to the hospital corridor, from Sophie's homework to financial decisions. And on one particularly long night, when snow covered the streets and the hospital waiting room felt emptier than usual, Margaret placed her hand gently on Daniel's shoulder and told him he needed to stay strong for Emily, her voice softer than before. And for a brief moment, Daniel felt seen in a way that surprised him, not just as a husband in crisis, but as a man struggling to hold everything together. And he did not yet realize that this growing closeness, built from shared worry and long silent nights, was quietly reshaping the boundaries of their relationship and setting the stage for emotions neither of them had planned to face. By the time winter settled fully over Chicago, Daniel's world had narrowed to two places: the hospital room where Emily lay fighting for strength, and the house that no longer felt entirely like his own. And in both places, Margaret moved with quiet authority, speaking to doctors with clear questions, organizing schedules on the fridge, answering calls from relatives, and making sure Sophie's life stayed steady. And at first Daniel told himself that her control was a blessing, because he was too tired to think clearly, too drained to argue, too scared to imagine what would happen if Emily did not wake up. So he let Margaret handle the insurance forms, the mortgage payment, even the small repairs around the house. And each time she solved a problem before he noticed it, he felt grateful, but also smaller, as if he were slowly stepping back while she stepped forward. Their days formed a routine. Mornings at the hospital where they stood side by side listening to updates, afternoons managing errands, evenings sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing bills under warm yellow light. And in that constant closeness, something unspoken began to grow, not planned, not wanted, just there, shaped by shared fear and long silences. One snowy evening, after visiting hours, ended early due to weather. They drove back through quiet streets, snowflakes hitting the windshield, the radio playing softly, and instead of going straight home, Margaret suggested they stop at a small diner, still open near the highway because Daniel had barely eaten. And inside the diner, the lights were dim, the booths nearly empty, the smell of coffee strong, and as they sat across from each other with steam rising from their cups, the conversation shifted from medical updates to memories. Margaret speaking about her late husband, about the loneliness that followed his passing, about the strength she had to find when raising Emily alone, and Daniel listened differently than before, not just hearing a mother protecting her daughter, but a woman who had known deep love and painful loss, and when she admitted that empty houses could feel louder than crowded rooms, Daniel felt something tighten in his chest because he understood exactly what she meant. They did not touch, they did not say anything improper, but their eyes held a little longer than usual, and when they returned home that night, the silence between them felt heavier, charged with awareness they both tried to ignore. Over the next weeks, their conversations grew more personal, still respectful, but softer. Margaret asking Daniel how he truly felt instead of what the doctors had said, Daniel admitting he was scared of failing Emily, scared of raising Sophie alone, scared of the quiet moments when hope felt thin, and Margaret offering reassurance with a calm voice and steady gaze that made him feel anchored. One night, a winter storm knocked out the power across the neighborhood, and candles flickered in the kitchen, casting gentle shadows on the walls, while Sophie slept upstairs, and Daniel and Margaret stood close to the counter, speaking in low tones about life's unpredictability, about how quickly everything could change, and in the dim light, Daniel noticed details he had never allowed himself to see before: the strength in her posture, the kindness in her eyes, the way grief had shaped her but not hardened her, and for a second he forgot she was his mother-in-law and simply saw her as someone who understood him completely. The realization startled him, and he stepped back slightly, clearing his throat, reminding himself silently that Emily was still fighting upstairs in a hospital bed, that loyalty meant more than comfort, yet the emotional closeness did not disappear just because he wished it away. Margaret sensed the shift too, her tone becoming more careful, her movements more measured, but the connection remained like a quiet current under calm water, and Daniel began noticing how much he relied on her presence, how empty the room felt when she went to pick Sophie up from school, how relieved he felt when she returned with grocery bags and practical solutions. At the hospital, they often sat together during long waiting periods, shoulders almost touching, reading updates on a tablet or watching the steady rise and fall of Emily's chest, and sometimes their hands brushed accidentally when reaching for the same chair. And though they always pulled back quickly, the brief contact lingered longer in Daniel's thoughts than he wanted to admit. He tried to focus on Emily's small signs of progress, a slight movement of fingers, a change in breathing pattern, but in the quiet hours he found himself replaying conversations with Margaret, analyzing tones and expressions, wondering when exactly support had begun to feel like companionship. Guilt crept in slowly, not because anything wrong had happened, but because he knew emotions could cross lines even without actions, and he began to question himself, to wonder if loneliness was shaping his heart in ways he did not recognize. One afternoon, while reviewing medical expenses at the dining table, their heads bent close over paperwork, Margaret's hand rested near his for a moment longer than necessary, neither of them speaking, both aware of the fragile boundary between comfort and something more. And Daniel felt a wave of confusion, because part of him felt understood in a way he had not felt in months, while another part whispered that he was drifting toward dangerous ground. He started finding reasons to step outside, to clear his head in the cold air, telling himself that exhaustion was playing tricks on him, that shared crisis often created temporary bonds, yet each time he returned inside and saw Margaret calmly preparing dinner or helping Sophie with homework, he felt drawn back into that quiet partnership. The house functioned smoothly under her care, bills paid on time, meals prepared, schedules organized, and Daniel realized that without intending to, they had begun operating like a team, making joint decisions about repairs, discussing financial planning, coordinating hospital visits, and though it all revolved around Emily's recovery, the rhythm between them felt almost natural, almost comfortable. And that comfort frightened him more than chaos would have. Late at night, he would lie awake, replaying vows he had made on his wedding day, reminding himself of promises spoken with full heart and clear mind, promising loyalty not only in action, but in thought. And he questioned whether emotional dependence counted as betrayal, even if no physical boundary had been crossed. Meanwhile, Margaret maintained a composed exterior, but small signs revealed her inner struggle. Pauses before speaking, longer looks that ended quickly, a softness in her voice when she said his name, and the tension between them grew not because of what they did, but because of what they both felt and refused to acknowledge. And so part two unfolded not with dramatic events or reckless decisions, but with subtle shifts, shared glances, and the slow realization that two lonely adults standing too close to each other in the shadow of illness could begin to blur lines they once believed were unbreakable, setting the stage for choices that would soon demand clarity, courage, and painful honesty. Spring arrived with cold rain and thin sunlight, and with it came small changes in Emily's condition that brought fragile hope back into Daniel's life. Because one morning, while he was holding her hand beside the hospital bed, he felt her fingers press weakly against his palm, and the nurse noticed it too, calling the doctor with quiet excitement. And in that moment, Daniel felt something clear and sharp cut through the fog that had surrounded him for months. He realized Emily was still there, still fighting, still connected to him, and as he leaned closer, whispering her name, promising he was right beside her, he felt both relief and shame rise together inside his chest, because during the long winter he had allowed himself to drift emotionally toward someone else. When he returned home that evening, the house looked the same, but felt different, as if the walls themselves were waiting for him to decide who he wanted to be, and Margaret was at the kitchen table sorting medical receipts, her glasses resting low on her nose, her expression focused yet tired, and when she looked up and saw the emotion in Daniel's face, she immediately stood, asking what happened, and he told her about the hand squeeze, about the doctor's cautious optimism, about the first real sign of improvement, and for a moment pure joy passed between them, shared relief that Emily might truly come back. Yet beneath that happiness lay something heavier, because both of them knew that Emily's recovery meant the temporary closeness between them could not continue in the same way. Over the next few days, Emily's progress continued. Small movements, faint attempts to open her eyes, responses to simple commands, and Daniel began spending even longer hours at the hospital, talking to her about Sophie's drawings, about the garden that needed planting, about how much he loved her, and with every word he felt his priorities settle back into place, steady and certain. At home, he started taking control again, cooking dinner, organizing bills, handling phone calls himself, gently telling Margaret he could manage, and though he spoke kindly, the distance was clear. Margaret noticed immediately, her posture becoming more formal, her tone careful, and one afternoon, as they both reached for the same stack of paperwork at the dining table, their hands touched and stayed there for a second too long, and the silence that followed was no longer warm, but tense, filled with awareness of everything unsaid. Daniel pulled his hand back first, his voice low as he said this was not right, that Emily needed him fully present, that he had allowed loneliness to confuse his heart, and Margaret listened without interruption, her eyes steady but shining with emotion. And she nodded slowly, admitting that shared worry had blurred lines neither of them meant to cross. They had not broken vows in action, but they both understood that emotional closeness carried its own weight, and that understanding settled heavily between them. That evening, Daniel drove alone to the hospital, replaying the past months in his mind, remembering candlelit conversations during the storm, late-night talks over tea, quiet looks across the kitchen, and he saw clearly now how easy it would have been to justify something more, how simple it might have felt in the moment to lean into comfort instead of stepping back, and that realization frightened him enough to strengthen his resolve. When he reached Emily's bedside, she was awake for a few brief minutes, her eyes unfocused but open, and when they met his, tears filled both of theirs, and in that silent exchange Daniel felt forgiveness, love, and responsibility all at once, and he promised himself he would rebuild what illness had shaken. The next day, Margaret began packing her suitcase quietly in the guest room, folding clothes with slow, deliberate movements, and when Daniel saw the open luggage on the bed, he understood without needing explanation. She told him it was time for her to return to Seattle, that Emily's recovery meant the household needed to belong to its original shape again, and that space was necessary for healing. And though her voice was calm, there was sadness beneath it. Daniel thanked her sincerely for everything she had done, for holding the family together when he felt like collapsing, for caring for Sophie, for managing the chaos, and he meant every word, but gratitude did not erase the complicated emotions they both carried. Before leaving, Margaret walked through the house slowly, touching the back of a chair, adjusting a photo frame she had once moved, pausing near the window where winter snow had once fallen heavily outside, and in those quiet gestures, Daniel saw the depth of her struggle, because stepping away required strength too. When she hugged him goodbye, the embrace was respectful but final, not lingering, not uncertain, simply two adults acknowledging a chapter that had nearly become something else, but would now close. After she left, the house felt strangely quiet again, yet this time the silence was clean, not charged, and Daniel stood alone in the kitchen, realizing how close he had come to damaging the very love he was fighting to save. He did not see himself as a villain, but as a man who had allowed grief and fear to cloud judgment, and that honesty became the foundation for what came next. As Emily continued improving, Daniel focused entirely on her recovery, attending therapy sessions, learning medical routines, listening to her soft questions about what she had missed, and when she asked how he had managed everything alone, he admitted it had not been easy, that he had felt lost and overwhelmed, but that he had never stopped loving her. And though he did not share every detail of his emotional struggle, his renewed dedication was clear in his actions. Part 3 became a turning point not because of dramatic betrayal, but because of the decision to step back before a line was fully crossed, a decision shaped by guilt, clarity, and the simple truth that love requires protection, even when hearts are vulnerable. And as spring sunlight slowly warmed the house again, Daniel understood that temptation often grows quietly in moments of weakness, but strength is shown in the choice to let go before everything breaks. By early summer, the air felt lighter, and so did the Harris home, because Emily was finally back in her own bedroom, propped up by pillows near the window, where sunlight slipped through soft curtains each morning. And though she was still weak and moved slowly, her presence alone changed everything. Daniel adjusted quickly to a new routine that revolved around her therapy appointments, medication schedules, and quiet evenings on the porch, where she could breathe fresh air without feeling overwhelmed, and every small improvement felt like a victory. From the first time she walked across the living room with assistance to the first time she laughed at one of Sophie's silly jokes, and Daniel watched each moment carefully, aware of how close he had come to losing it all. The house no longer felt controlled by crisis, but guided by intention, and Daniel made sure of that by taking full responsibility for decisions, cooking simple meals even if they were not perfect, handling finances without hesitation, and asking Emily's opinion about even the smallest changes, because he wanted her to feel rooted again in the life they built together. Some evenings they talked quietly after Sophie went to bed, sharing honest thoughts about fear, about how illness had shaken their sense of safety, about how fragile time could be, and Daniel admitted he had felt lost during her absence, overwhelmed by loneliness and pressure. And though he chose his words carefully, Emily understood that hardship had tested him deeply, and instead of anger, she responded with calm strength, explaining that recovery was not only physical, but emotional too, and that both of them would need patience. Trust was not broken, but it had been strained by circumstance, and they both recognized that healing required effort. Meanwhile, Margaret kept her distance respectfully, calling once a week to check on Emily's progress, her tone warm but measured, never overstepping. And when she spoke to Daniel, their conversations remained polite, centered only on updates and family matters, because both knew boundaries now had to remain clear. One afternoon, a handwritten letter arrived from Seattle, and Daniel recognized Margaret's steady handwriting immediately, and he opened it alone in the kitchen while Emily rested upstairs, reading words that were simple yet heavy with meaning, as Margaret expressed gratitude for being allowed to help during the crisis, acknowledged that shared hardship could create complicated emotions, and made it clear she would always prioritize her daughter's happiness above everything else. And Daniel felt respect for her honesty, because stepping back had not been easy for either of them. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not as a secret, but as a reminder of how delicate loyalty can be when life feels uncertain. As weeks passed, Emily regained more independence, preparing light breakfasts, watering plants in the garden, sitting at the dining table to help Sophie with homework, and Daniel found joy in ordinary moments that once seemed small, realizing how quickly routine can disappear and how precious it truly is. Sometimes late at night, he would stand quietly in the hallway, listening to the soft rhythm of his family's breathing, and reflect on the choices he had made, thankful that emotional confusion had not turned into lasting damage, aware that strength often shows itself in restraint rather than action. He began attending counseling sessions with Emily, not because something dramatic had happened, but because both wanted to build deeper understanding after surviving such a heavy season. And in those sessions, they spoke openly about vulnerability, about how easy it is to cling to comfort when fear takes over, and how important it is to return to shared values when clarity returns. Daniel never painted himself as flawless, and Emily never treated him as a stranger, because what they faced was not betrayal in action, but temptation born from exhaustion. And that distinction mattered as they rebuilt. By late summer, the garden was blooming again, bright flowers lining the walkway, Sophie riding her bike along the driveway, and Emily sitting outside with a light blanket around her shoulders, watching the sunset beside Daniel. And in that calm golden light, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for her recovery, but for the lesson hidden inside the storm, that love must be guarded, especially during weakness, that emotional lines deserve as much respect as physical ones, and that loneliness can blur judgment if left unchecked. Margaret eventually visited briefly in the fall, her arrival warm but careful, and when she hugged Emily, there were tears of relief. When she greeted Daniel, there was dignity and quiet understanding, and throughout the visit, boundaries remained steady. Conversations centered on family, on progress, on Sophie's school stories, and when Margaret left again, the farewell felt peaceful, not heavy. Part 4 closed not with dramatic confrontation, but with maturity, growth, and the decision to choose commitment every single day. And Daniel understood that what nearly happened had served as a warning rather than a wound, a reminder that even good people can drift when fear clouds their vision, yet they can also return stronger when guided by honesty and purpose. And as the seasons continued to change outside their home, the Harris family moved forward with deeper appreciation for each other, aware that love is not only about passion or comfort, but about steady loyalty when life tests the heart.